Chapter 3. Hoaxes and False Flags. Public liars have been messing with our heads for centuries in confidence games, hoaxes, disinformation campaigns, and false flag operations. Of course, many are motivated merely by cash or a desire for acclaim. Take Clifford Irving's fake biography of Howard Hughes, or Rosie Cruise's phony first-place finish in the 1980 Boston Marathon. But hoaxes can sometimes influence public policy significantly enough to change the direction of a nation. An example of the latter was the so-called Zinoviev letter. Created by British intelligence, the letter claimed that a Soviet revolution was about to take place in England. The scare was effective enough to get Britons to elect a conservative government. The rationale for war in Iraq was similar: a political hoax fueled by a series of lies, spread by the president and others to sell an invasion and occupation. The most notorious falsehood involved maybe the one sold to Congress and the public in George Bush's 2003 State of the Union, that Saddam Hussein was seeking African uranium for a nuclear weapon. At various points, however, Bush officials also asserted that Iraq was responsible for the 9/11 attacks, directly linked to al-Qaeda, trying to import aluminum tubes, hiding vast stocks of chemical and biological weapons from the first Gulf War, capable of developing smallpox, obstructing weapons inspectors, and able to deploy WMDs in 45 minutes. None of this turned out to be true, but a rolling series of lies was considered necessary for, quote, national security, and easy to rationalize in part because some members of the Bush team were admirers of Leo Strauss, a great believer in the usefulness of lies in politics. Secrecy and deception, a veritable culture of lies, are necessary, Strauss argued. They protect, quote, the wise, those with the natural right to rule, from the vulgar masses, who would otherwise be ungovernable and rise up against them. He called such tactics noble lies, the grease of aggressively nationalistic politics. Strauss wrote, "Because mankind is intrinsically wicked, he has to be governed. Such governance can only be established, however, when men are united, and they can only be united against other people." This explains how nations can be misled into war and why authoritarians aggressively attack critics and rarely admit mistakes. For some demagogues, lying is more than an option. It is essential, a feature rather than a glitch. So is a supply of enemies, both abroad and at home. Journalists who spread false stories for personal advancement undermine the credibility of the profession. Patricia Smith, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, was forced to resign from the Boston Globe after making up people and quotes for her columns. And Stephen Glass, a New Republic writer, was fired after confessing that he invented news in dozens of articles. But the deceptions of such fabulous seem trivial when compared with how members of the press helped to promote a U.S. NATO bombing during the Yugoslavian war with distortions and speculation about negotiations and body counts. After the war ended, claims of genocide were quietly dropped, but the cover story stuck. False flag operations, often featuring a terrorist act, occur when governments or elements of a regime stage a secret operation, one in which operatives pretend to be the enemy while attacking their own forces or people. The resulting outrage is usually blamed on the real foe in order to justify destabilization or war. Fake news is usually part of the package, in this context a synonym for disinformation. A recent Tom Cruise movie, America Made, recreates an infamous example. The target of the disinformation in this case was Nicaragua. The authors were the president and his men, and the lie was that Sandinista leaders had struck a deal with the Medellin drug cartel to smuggle drugs into America. In the film, Cruise plays Barry Seal, an amoral drug smuggler and government informer whose lies about the drug operation and a suspicious photo became a deadly example of fake news. Another glaring case involves the circumstances that led to expanded war in Vietnam. According to official history, two U.S. destroyers patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin off North Vietnam were victims of unprovoked attacks in August 1964, leading to a congressional resolution that gave President Johnson the power to, quote, take all necessary measures. In fact, the destroyers were spy ships, part of a National Security Agency eavesdropping program operating near the coast as a way to provoke the North Vietnamese into turning on their radar and other communications channels. The more provocative the maneuvers, the more signals that could be captured. Meanwhile, U.S. raiding parties were shelling mainland targets. Documents revealed later that the August 4th attack on the USS Maddox, the pretext for passing the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, may not have taken place. But even if it did, the incident was spun to build congressional and public support for the war. Many people remain convinced that the most consequential false flag operation of our time was the 9/11 attacks. The Bush administration certainly exploited that event, within days launching its plans to invade Afghanistan and Iraq. Official complicity could have taken many possible forms, yet mainstream media consistently declined to examine the exhaustively documented case developed by critics of the official story. To this day, when confronted with unsettling 9/11 information, many people simply retreat into denial. Most journalists just laugh. If 9/11 was some sort of inside job, why would anyone want such destruction? It's a fair question. Another is who knew, and even more important, who made it possible? Aware of such questions, David Ray Griffin tried to stick with what was known when he spoke, and in the years following the tragedy, he studied the available evidence and published several books on the subject, including The New Pearl Harbor, Disturbing Questions About the Bush Administration and 9/11, and also the 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions. In the end, he concluded that if there was official complicity, U.S. leaders might have played no active role. Instead, they could simply have concealed embarrassing facts after the fact to better exploit the tragedy. Another possibility is that intelligence agents had some advanced knowledge, but didn't do anything to prevent the attacks and instead persuaded the administration to help with the cover-up. Even more difficult for some people to handle is the suggestion that elements within the intelligence community or Pentagon knew exactly what was going to happen or took part. And perhaps the most controversial theory of all, at least the one most apt to spark angry denials, is that officials in the executive branch knew or even provided assistance. Why hadn't anyone spoken up? As Griffin brought his analysis to audiences around the country, he was often asked such questions. In other words, how could such a thing be kept secret? We don't know the secrets they've kept, he replied when I asked him the question. The Manhattan Project to create the atomic bomb was kept secret for a long time, he said, as well as a war in Indonesia during the 1950s. Things are compartmentalized, with information available on a need-to-know basis. Most people are afraid for their jobs, he continued. If they talk and disobey, they can be imprisoned, and worse. And when people have spoken with the press, they haven't reported it. But members of the New York police and the fire departments know it was an inside job. Another possible reason that the truth has been so successfully hidden, he added, is that, quote, those who know probably think it would be so disturbing that it's better to let people believe the official versions. So what's the truth? We may never know. But almost everyone accepts one conspiracy or another. The problem, in an age of global networks that are better at distribution than discrimination, is telling the difference between theory and fact, speculation and evidence.